Hi, I'm Mara, and welcome to my channel if you're new, and welcome back if you've been here. Today, in my video, I'm going to be starting the process of sharing my story publicly for the first time. I do need to put a trigger warning here and say that this video is going to discuss CA, CSA, and suicidal ideation. If you can't hear this right now, please know I've been there. It's okay. I get it. I don't want you to hurt yourself, and I'm very grateful to have you here on the planet with us today. So I am the second oldest of 10 children. I have chosen to deny the people who raised me the honor of acknowledging them as my parents, but it's okay if you refer to them that way. I understand that sometimes it's the easiest word for them. The man and woman who raised me, who both also provided their DNA for my creation, were raised in the outside world and were relatively normal. Neither was Amish or even very religious in their upbringings. They met out at college party in Orlando, Florida. When she was 18, he was 21, and they had sex. Whoopsie daisy, she ends up pregnant, and because of a sense of moral obligation, they married. She ended up losing that child. A sneaky part of me wonders if it actually existed, but soon after had my oldest sister, dropped out of college, and then had me 2 years later. The man who raised me stayed in college, not just to get his bachelor's, but even a dual master's degree in political science and macroeconomics. By all reports, he was very smart. He presented very well, was charming and funny, and made friends very easily. He was also starting to show more and more of his weird breaking through, though, so he didn't keep friends well. Starting at age 3, I was homeschooled along with my older sister. She hated it, but we ended up staying in the same grade until we graduated. We only ever left the properties we rented in trailer parks when the woman who raised us took us along food shopping or to the occasional fun family park outing to make up for the escalating physical, emotional, and mental abuse. I had nowhere to meet friends and wasn't allowed them anyway. We weren't allowed to play outside with the other kids on the street. We had to play together or stay inside. We didn't have TV, although in the beginning we did have a VCR player with educational tapes we could play to entertain ourselves. All this time, the people who raised me began slowly getting more and more Christian. My overalls were taken away at 4, replaced with long skirts, and when I was 8 or 9, I had to start wearing head coverings at all waking times. The style varied, first with the taste of the woman who raised me, like little bonnety snood things, and then with some styles of the different churches we attended or attempted to join, moving eventually to a headscarf when we were Amish. During this time, we never stayed at any church for longer than a month. We spent a few years trying out different churches on Sundays. Huge, loud churches where the pastors screamed and I got scared. Small churches with loud drum sets, and medium churches with Sunday schools we weren't allowed to attend for fear of indoctrination, i.e. them losing control over us. No one was godly enough for them, so they eventually switched to home churching with a family from one of the churches we had visited. Eventually, this poor, sweet family realized that the man who raised me didn't want a church, he wanted a cult, and they correctly fled. Then it was just us having church together in our own home every Sunday. The man who raised me would read all the teachings of every Christian fundamentalist he could find and began using them as the basis for his own doctrine, which is what every power-crazed weirdo does when they find their way into this rabbit hole. You see, a lot of these Christian fundamentalist groups deny having connections with one another, but this is a bunch of baloney. Evangelical, fundamentalist, Christian groups love to read each other's books, and this provides a feedback loop. Bill Gothard and the Amish may have nothing to do with one another, but then why was I taught from his curriculum as part of my Amish homeschooling? We got it from the church, so that's what they were officially using too. Not all of it, to be sure, but convenient bits and pieces. What this leads to is all these bits and pieces getting wrapped up in their core belief of what it means to be a Christian, although these teachings may not even be from the Bible. Everyone then adds their opinions over the generally accepted baseline, competing to have the next bit or piece to be incorporated. The longer you spend in this loop, the more distorted your thinking gets and the greater your disassociation from reality gets. It's very easy to move from, I'm gonna be the next insert pastor here, to no one agrees with me, which can't be a reflection of my rhetoric and must mean that the devil is waging a war on me, and anyone who disagrees with me should be cast into hell. That's not an exaggeration. I have heard language like that far too many times in my past. The Amish are peaceful, my foot. They'll take your satanic money with a smile and go to sleep at night happy knowing that their miserable life is worth it because you're going to hell and they're not. Fucking fight me. I know this because I was taught to think this way too. I used to sleep on the floor at night occasionally just to make sure I was miserable enough, unlike you unholy lot. When I was 9, Hurricane Charlie hit Orlando and took out our power for about 2 weeks. During this, the people who raised me made a joke about becoming Amish, and then it sort of became not a joke. They found a Mennonite community 2 hours away because there wasn't a local Amish church in that area of Florida because it's really hot, but it wasn't what they wanted. It led them to a man taking his family to an Amish community in Tennessee, though, so they followed him basically sight unseen to the same church. Joining an Amish community is a process by which outsiders are accepted into the church, usually baptized into it, and marriage is then permitted between these eligible outsiders and members of the church. They are expected to fully conform to the lifestyle and traditions of the church for life. If allowed to marry an outsider's great-grandchild, if all other marriages are Amish, would be accepted as fully Amish. And I also want to put this out there and be very, very clear. The Amish are racist, homophobic, anti-Semitic, ableist, and a host of other hateful things. This seems to be knowledge that not everyone has, which blows my mind a little bit. I'll have to dedicate some time to how they use the Bible to justify their hate, because it gets complicated. The Amish church we tried to join was very interested in the number of potential baby makers in my family, so they wanted to accept us. They were running out of eligible blood for their sons to marry, since first and second cousins are not allowed to marry each other after the catastrophic results of inbreeding. The woman who raised me, however, is a narcissist, and rules intended to control her children didn't apply to her. She went out of her way to sabotage our acceptance into the community. In hindsight, that may not seem so bad, but she did it by not following the rules that she brutally enforced on us. After a year, the church said they'd accept me, my older sister, the man who raised me, but not the woman who raised me. He decided that he wouldn't join without her, so asked the church to reconsider. A year later, her behavior had gotten worse, and his psychosis was starting to show. So it was surprising that the church gave the same offer again, but he again refused it. We were living in a house provided by the community for new members at this time, and we didn't leave the house after the second refusal. Instead, the community forced us out with psychological warfare tactics over the next 2 years. The man who raised me became completely unhinged, paranoid, and separated from reality. Those 2 years were very dark. I experienced psychosis. I was drugged. I woke up to a random woman standing next to my bed in the middle of the night. I was targeted with rifle scopes. And some even more horrible things happened that I'll dedicate their own video to. I don't want to have to upgrade the trigger warning on this one. As a result of concern for the lives of all my siblings, the people who raised me and myself, I went to the man who raised me when I was 14 and begged him to leave, to take us out of the community. He lectured me about God's will, but I was honestly a little bit surprised that he didn't kill me, and even more surprised when we moved out of that house a week later. We spent another year in a house owned by someone in the church, but a lot farther removed. Eventually, the man who raised me got a job through the stimulus package. Thank you so much, Obama. And we eventually moved out of the community entirely. Of course, that wasn't the end of it, though. Around the time of this move, the man who raised me began raping my older sister, who was around 16 at this time. I don't know the full extent of the abuse, as I wasn't brought into the loop on it until I was nearly 16, more than a year later, when the man who raised me informed me of the circumstances so that I would convince her to stay, since she wanted to run away. I was young, dumb, and brainwashed, so I did what I was told. I regret this, but it was an impossible situation that I never should have been put in, and all the blame goes to him. I did convince her to stay, and she hasn't been the same since, although life has gotten a lot better for her. I woke up on March 3rd, 2012, when I was 17 with a sudden realization that everything was wrong. My mind snapped out of it overnight, and I left to walk into town and look for a job. I didn't find one at first, but I did get raped, and I eventually left Tennessee to go to college in New York. It's been 10 years, almost to the day, at the time of recording, since I woke up. That's wild. Blasting straight from being a homeschooled, sheltered, stay-at-home mom-to-be, it took me a couple years to start finding my footings. Slowly, I began pretending to integrate into life on the outside. Great things did happen. I found my partner, got a degree in engineering, got a job, and got married. But I always felt disjointed, lost, and overwhelmed. I had built a wall in my brain when I had moved away from Tennessee, and could not access any memory behind that wall without panic attacks and anguish. I was faking it, but I was feeling the cracks in the amplitude of my fear breaking, which would have been a good thing if that wasn't the only thing driving me forward. Of course, I didn't realize that at the time, and I felt that my strength was failing. And then the pandemic ended up triggering my memories of isolation as a child and teenager, and the wall began to crumble in my mind. The pain led me to attempt to end my life, at which I thankfully did not succeed. But I did end up admitting that I needed help and went looking for it. I spent 13 weeks in mental hospitals over a 6-month period, and finally began working through what had happened to me. I got a lot of wonderful help, and now I'm doing a lot better, though I still have PTSD and it still sucks. As part of my journey, I've been learning about other cult groups, and it has really struck me to see adults from Jonestown or the family who, even after so much time, clearly still struggle with what happened to them and still have PTSD or don't fully manage to make society's standards of daily functioning. It's made me realize that there's no good space for those of us leaving any cult, regardless of what that cult looked like. No space in our old communities, and none in the outside world either. How long is it supposed to take to get over this? What is that even supposed to look like? For a society so obsessed with cults, you'd think that there might be more space or consideration made for those who leave or survive them. We stare in horror, trying to imagine what it would be like to experience these horrific things, and then move on. How long will it take me to forget the sounds of the people who raised me beating my 6-year-old sister with a 2x4 plank more than 250 times because she had not done some of her homework? They had to take breaks because their arms hurt too bad. They were laughing about it, while I and the rest of my siblings were huddled together in the front yard, sobbing on one another regardless of age or gender. That's not something you forget. I have a special power that those born to the outside world don't have. I know of another way of life, other ways of doing things. I don't like every part of normal society, and that makes sense when you realize that I wasn't raised for this. I struggle to work a job daily, partially because I never went to school, which helps, I think, with our conditioning to go to work every day. But also, the woman who raised me didn't work. It wasn't expected that I would work, and even the man who raised me hasn't held many traditional jobs in his life. I worked a lot on my farm and on other farms, but that's a very different dynamic. It's relatively short-term, changing work because a lot of crops don't need continuous harvesting. It's very short-term, changing work. You might be tempted to look at my story and misappropriate blame to suit a personal narrative. You might be tempted to say that the people who raised me were insane, but this doesn't mean that the Amish and Mennonites are like them. To this, I would counter that a shocking number are just as insane, and that even when they aren't, they enable behavior like this. I've never heard of an Amish community that has ever reported child abuse to the correct authority, regardless of whether they are a traditional or evangelical church. You might be tempted to write off the people who raised me as, well, they're a one-off and there can't be many people like them. But that's also not true. There are a shocking number of families drifting around the fringes of these communities, using the main group to add legitimacy to their own actions. These churches know. They know what these families are up to, often because the families tried to join the church and the church said no. But the church does nothing about it, even if it disagrees with some of the practices. I lost my childhood and teen years to abuse, and I've lost my adult years so far to healing from that abuse. Christian groups in the U.S. have been performing a real-time social experiment by implementing abusive child-raising techniques, and I am a perfect image of how they made me. Broken, hurting, untrusting, and scared. This was the goal, and they executed it perfectly. To those who contributed to this, your stupid experiment is a failure. It's time for the rest of us to stand up and shut them down. Michael and Debbie Pearl's horrific book, To Train Up a Child, is still somehow for sale on Amazon now. And now my generation gets to keep this shit going for another round. Enough. Stop. Burn it down. Tear out evil by the roots wherever it is lurking. Even when it's in these supposedly Christian communities. No one saved me. I had to save myself. I was an emaciated and bruised piece of property. A slave to the people who raised me. This isn't a long ago story. This is child slavery happening now, here in the U.S., to far too many children at this exact moment. If you're offended by this, tough luck. I'm offended by child abuse. I'm not advocating for the end of Christianity or anything nearly so drastic, but calling for the system that we already have to do its job. Police, doctors, and mandated reporters on the outside are turning a blind eye, and this cannot stand. Honestly, as crazy as it is to say this, I got out alive and relatively unscathed. My siblings are developing autoimmune disorders at an alarming rate as the years of PTSD are taking their toll, and others I know lost their lives or their sanity before they could get out. I'll share their stories in an Amish story time soon, since they deserve all of the honor, love, and respect they never got. You can help those of us coming out. One of the first challenges I experienced on the outside was being told by idiots who had watched Breaking Amish or something that I was just flat out wrong. I've also been told that because someone's aunt buys apples off an Amish community that I'm lying. I was there and lived it. Having my trauma dismissed as being made up or outside the norm is very harmful, to put it nicely. America loves Amish churches for some reason, but you can help by raising awareness that horrible practices are very often concealed behind the pious front they present. To be honest, I struggled to write the end of this video. It took me a little while to realize it was because, as usual, I don't have an ending. But that's why this is going to be a series. I'm going to be handling this at my own pace, telling my complicated past in chunks. I've shared some of these stories before, but very occasionally and very privately, so I need practice. The first times I shared these stories, it was difficult to speak through my tears. It's not nearly so bad now, but I'm still trying to find the right words. So I hope you'll bear with me a little bit. In my next episode, I plan to focus on the people who raised me in more detail, provide some of their background and context before diving into the deep end of what they did. If you're here and you heard me today, thank you. I know these conversations are not easy, so I don't often get to have them. I also never got to speak up growing up, so being heard means the world to me. Thank you, friends. Bye-bye. stopped my video because of I was getting a phone call and it was spam. Rude.